From the Psych Hub Podcast Network, welcome to Coming Back Better, a podcast sponsored by HCA Healthcare and in collaboration with Columbia University Department of Psychiatry.
Welcome back to Coming Back Better, and I hope everyone had a happy new year, and welcome back, Marjorie. Good to be back with you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back. Nice holiday season and new year, and feels like it's going to be a great year.
Yeah, 2023, here we go. And we're starting off with our first episode in the new year about adolescents and young adults and how they were impacted by the pandemic.
In what feels like a clearing in the pandemic, we're seeing just how dark it got for many teens.
New data from the CDC shows more than a third of high school students are struggling with their mental health.
Studies show teens spend as much as 9 hours a day on social media, and research shows alarming effects it's having on teenage girls.
And thinking back to COVID and my son Noah, who was a senior in high school at the time, we had been looking forward to actually a big party for his graduation. I think I've shared before that Noah was on the autism spectrum. We had kept in touch with teachers all the way back to first and second grade, and we were planning this big, joyous celebration of Noah's finishing up school. And then the lockdown hit during spring break of senior year, and the whole plans just ended. And I don't know how much Noah was looking forward to it, but my wife and I were all excited for this grand celebration that just didn't happen. That was really hard.
It's so interesting to think about not only what happened when it first hit and all that trauma and stress and fear, and then what happened when it becomes normal, becomes part of life. But boy, did we learn a lot about what isolation, social isolation does for all of us, but especially our kids.
Right.
I love this episode. I love the interviews that I know I got to do. I can't wait to hear about yours. So, Paul, let's just jump right in. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hear from Elyse Jewel. She is a super cool singer-songwriter that was in high school during the pandemic. And she's going to share her story about really what it was like for her to be in lockdown during this time in her life. And she gives us a really raw account of how it affected her.
All right, can't wait to hear.
Before we go in and listen to her, I just want to play a short clip of one of her songs, which is awesome, Fine by Me.
That's fine by me. What I said got lost in translation. Sorry. Then again, you may be overcomplicated some things.
I'd love to hear about your thoughts about just mental health, what the typical mental health experience of teens was like during COVID and maybe some of the aftermaths of it now.
Well, it definitely was not uncommon for kids my age to have mental health struggles. I remember talking to just like all my friends during quarantine and not being able to see them, and we were all definitely not in the highest of moods. I mean, while it gave me an opportunity to like decorate my room, sleep in, I definitely would have preferred seeing my friends every day and not on computer screens on Zoom calls. It was isolating, and it was hard to kind of fathom life even before like isolation. And I know after, it was so bizarre, and I was absolutely horrified to go back to school. And I feel like over quarantine, I kind of lost connection with some of like my people. And that was kind of hard to deal with, and seeing them get close to people who live closer to them, or if they were going into school, because like we were able to choose if we wanted to go in person or virtual. And so just like watching some of my really close friends kind of drift away into people that they see every day, which it wasn't an easy thing to kind of see and deal with, especially because I'm at home just sitting and kind of watching things play out, basically.
Do you feel like what your experience was like was similar to other teens?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think like every kid in the world can kind of relate in some form or fashion. I mean, school's our life. At this age, it's like we literally get up to go to school. and we get up to see our friends. And then whenever that changed and we couldn't necessarily do that, or at least not in the normal way, it was hard and it was different, especially for me. Like, I'm a person who hates change. So change is very, very hard for me. And just getting used to getting up and having the whole day by myself, basically, it was difficult to deal with.
It's so interesting just to think about the collective experience that all these people have had the same experience kind of together, but yet very separately. What are your thoughts about, when quarantine's then over, then like you said, then everybody goes back. Are people different now? Do you think it changed?
I know I definitely kind of changed as a person, but it's also difficult to tell because I went into high school as a freshman and I came back as a junior. So I definitely had growth just within my personality by itself because, age. But I did realize that it was kind of awkward at first, like talking to people and starting conversation. I'm an extrovert and it was hard for me. I was scared. I was like, wait, because some of these people, like, they haven't been at home for the last year and a half. And I have. And so I was scared to talk to people. I was like, I don't want them to judge me or be like, oh, she doesn't know how to talk to people anymore. Because I really didn't. It was difficult.
Did you find that social media had played a role in all of this too?
I think social media is funny because it can be so damaging, yet it can connect so many people together. Especially, I know on TikTok, I was on TikTok all the time and it was nice just to see kids kind of my age and making videos about things that I was going through. So in that sense, it did make me feel less alone. At the same time, it's like, oh, I also saw Snapchat videos of, like I said earlier, my friends in school in person with other people. And I was a little envious. I was a wee bit envious.
So when we think about some of the mental health issues, it sounds like isolation, being left out. What else? Because we hear so much about teens right now and depression and anxiety, eating disorders. Do you feel like that was kind of what contributed to that?
Yeah, I definitely think that it played a role. For me personally, I was basically in charge of when I ate, I'd wake up and then I was able to work at my own pace, but it kind of got to a point where I was like, okay, well, I can't have lunch until I finish this assignment. I can't eat until I finish all of my schoolwork for the day, which then ended at 3. So I would kind of be skipping breakfast and lunch-ish. And I know that kind of stayed true for some of my friends too. They did a similar thing, which definitely is not the healthiest thing. Do not recommend, but it kind of just became the new normal. I kind of thought of it as a reward, which not a healthy mindset. I think it was also hard because I don't have anybody motivating me. It's literally just fully relying on myself, which is hard, especially I think at this age.
When you were at school, was that different?
Yeah. I had my friends to talk to and we were all kind of together. And I think for the eating, there was set time.
That's right. School does that for you. Do you have any thoughts on anxiety? We're hearing so much about adolescence and anxiety. And can you relate to that at all?
I have generalized anxiety disorder. So that's an issue in itself. COVID did not help with that. First of all, here I am eating less, feeling bad, and then also stressing myself out. Okay, I need to finish this assignment. I need to finish this. I need to finish this. And then not having as many resources to learn the material was also hard. And it definitely didn't feel good. And it was definitely stressful. And I think that some of the lowest my mental health has ever been was whenever I was in isolation, because all I had was myself to kind of rely on. It's not a great feeling. And you're just like, what do I do? I can't do anything. And then I'm seeing all these people. And then, oh my gosh, what if they don't like me anymore?
Anything that you've done that's helped?
Obviously, as things have opened up, I've been spending every moment I can with the people I love and just kind of basking in that glory of, oh my gosh, I can see people. I kind of came to realize what a healthy mindset looks like and what a healthy mindset doesn't look like. That's definitely helped me, giving myself time to kind of just reflect and self-care time, whether that's being with my friends and not having to worry about all these stressors, or just, sitting in my room and watching Netflix and doing my nails. I think that I was so wrapped up in like wanting to do something during like COVID that I kind of lost touch of what I could have maybe taken advantage of, which was taking that time to reflect and do self-care, because that's all I could really do. And instead I was kind of anticipating, okay, when is this going to be over? When can I see my friends again?
What would you say, just because of your music and writing, is there any connection there with mental health?
Writing is my number one outlet. If I didn't have music and if I didn't do songwriting, I have no clue where I would be right now. It's the one thing that's kind of kept me going and that's allowed me to really, truly like express myself without feeling any sort of like judgment or anything behind that. So I use it as an outlet to express myself. And if I'm like sad or crying, I will literally sing a sad song and I'll be like, I feel better now. I think just finding something that makes you happy and something that allows you to express yourself, especially something so personal that kind of allows you to connect with yourself and express yourself in a non-conventional way. I think that really has helped me too.
Where could listeners go if they want to find out more about you?
Well, my music is on all platforms and social media accounts like Instagram, TikTok, and on my website, which is just ElyseJewel.com.
That was heartwarming to listen to Elyse's experience and get that firsthand sense of what it was like to be a teen. Connection was such a powerful sense coming through of how that was disrupted, and really making efforts to find other ways to continue the connection. Peers are so important for this age group. So I appreciated her sharing how challenging it was to keep those connections going.
It's so interesting too to hear about, how we've talked about this before, but how you get nervous to just talk to people again.
Right.
And you can be
right.
an extrovert, but yet I don't have to do that anymore. And then all of a sudden you're like, no, I have to do it. I get that was hard.
I'm just thinking back, awkward is a word that comes to mind about teenage years. And even for a cool teen, that there's awkwardness and how those skills were so quickly lost with the social connection face to face. And all the questions and doubts and insecurities that came rolling back in to try to get back to what was normal, seeing people face to face around school.
But what I love is that she leaned into music and
Yeah.
songwriting as her self-care. I just
Yeah.
thought that is such a beautiful thing, is that how people can find something like that makes them feel positive about.
What I appreciated was a way to express herself. She had that. And thinking about in therapy, working with teenagers, and sometimes they just need a way to get it out. Sometimes the peers are how they get things out. And when they were cut off from their peers, she found another way to let those emotions, those thoughts, those feelings in a real healing way through her music. And thinking that teens had to get creative and find different ways to manage what was stirring inside.
Paul, one of the things that she just talked about a lot was eating. She would sometimes just not eat until she finished school. I mean, that's probably pretty common. Eating disorders have really been on the rise since COVID, and it's complicated. It's really complicated for all of us to understand what happened, why is that happening? And it's pretty profound in all different areas geographically. It isn't one area. We had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Glassifer, and one of these experts in this space. She's the associate professor of clinical medical psychology and psychiatry. And she works at Columbia's Department of Psychiatry, where she provides instruction and supervision in cognitive behavioral therapy with adults with anxiety, mood, and eating disorders. She's going to talk about how the disruption of routine really affected people with school, because all of a sudden now you don't have time to eat. And it's really unhealthy, and can be if you think about food as a reward. So I'm looking forward to you guys hearing this really interesting conversation I had with her.
Yeah, especially after listening to Elise's comments about how the lockdown affected her eating routine. I do want to hear more, so let's take a listen.
Adolescents were more physically inactive, exposed to a longer screen time, and had more inadequate sleep patterns during COVID. What effect did this have on mental health?
It's hard to even imagine what might have been like to go through this at a time in life where what's supposed to be happening is a shift from being focused on your family to being focused on your friends and your social development. For adolescents during this pandemic, there was a lot of isolation. The longer screen time may reflect attempts for some teens to stay as social as would be appropriate for their age and stage. They really used the screens to stay engaged socially. But I think we all know it's not really the same to interact with people over a screen or in relation to something you're watching on a screen as it is to hang out with friends and pick up all the cues that you might from in-person interaction. We also have to acknowledge that not all screen time was social. That sure, some of it was school, but a lot of it was also a way in which they might have just generally been out in the world less, even in ways that would have been appropriate at certain stages of the pandemic. I think it's been hard for kids to motivate to go out for a walk, to just read a actual book rather than to be watching a show. So there were things that were available to them that more and more life was sort of happening on the screen. There were real constraints on all of us in terms of how physically active we could be, but adults are a little more used to the idea of carving out dedicated time for activity and exercise than teenagers are, right? Teenagers have it built into their social experiences, their sports practice, whereas adults who are physically active figure out when that's going to happen. And so I think this was a situation where it was asking something very challenging of a teenager to think about taking care of themselves and making sure they were getting enough activity, because that's something that's a little more intuitive to their lifestyle. And on the other hand, in my work as an eating disorder specialist, I do want to acknowledge that for folks who are really vulnerable to more restrictive kinds of eating problems, those kids were potentially getting more active in a not so healthy way. An idea took hold that, oh, this is the time to change how I look in a certain way, or I'm going to try this new workout, and things that for some kids would be really healthy and great. If you're vulnerable to a certain set of problems, for these other kids really took on a life of their own. Rates of depression have gone up, rates of anxiety have gone up. Certainly we're seeing more eating disorders in teenagers. It's been stressful and hard. And we have to remember that this is a developmental period of our lives that is already usually hard.
We hear a lot about young girls and how they are particularly sensitive to eating disorders during COVID. Why is it? Why does it affect females more than males?
The very first thing I want to acknowledge here is that men and boys are impacted by eating disorders. So I think there is some misinformation out there that it's only teenage girls who can develop an eating disorder. And that's really not true. But like many other mental health problems, depression, anxiety, for example, females do seem to be disproportionately vulnerable relative to males. This is true in eating disorders as well. There are a couple things that, in addition to being female, we know to be risk factors for the onset of an eating disorder. One of those risk factors is going through puberty. We know that going through acute stress or trauma can also leave someone vulnerable to developing an eating disorder. And so here we have this perfect storm of this developmental window where a subset of our population is at increased risk for this kind of problem, and they're hit with a very unique stressor. And in fact, we have seen in the US, the overall incidence of eating disorders increase during the pandemic. And it's worth noting that that's not unique to the US, that we're seeing reports of this from many different countries and from community samples. And the increase in risk is occurring disproportionately in adolescents and adolescent girls. And the disorder, most specifically where we're seeing the increase, is anorexia nervosa. There are other symptoms and eating issues that we're seeing an increase in. So things like binge eating or urges to overdo it with food. But when we're talking about a frank eating disorder, the increase in risk is primarily to adolescent girls and for anorexia nervosa, which is a very serious eating disorder, which involves really a highly restrictive intake and either weight loss or, for a teenager, failure to make the growth and weight changes we would expect to see during this time.
What kind of tips do you recommend for listeners of this population that are parents of kids that are going through this?
It's good for parents to have some sense of how eating is going. If you've got a young adult at college or you've got a teenager in your house, how is their eating going? Are you seeing major changes in appearance? Are you seeing major changes in mood? Are you seeing avoidance of certain situations that may be fueled by anxiety worsening? As parents, you know your kids well. So how big are the changes? I also think if you've got an adolescent in your life or a young adult in your life, it is worth engaging them in conversation around their social media diet and figuring out like what kind of stuff are they looking at online? What messages are they hearing? How do they react to those messages? Because these things can have a huge impact on how much and in what ways adolescents and young folks are thinking about health. And there are a lot of really positive, balanced messages out there around fitness and eating and appearance, but there's also a lot of really extreme information out there. And also to make sure that they are not overly focused on this whole area and that they're continuing to develop and pursue interests in a number of different things, because that's what that time in life is about.
Well, it was really interesting in a follow-up listening to Dr. Glassifer and reflecting on what Elyse Jewel had shared. And that, yeah, this is a time of life when family's not, necessarily as important as peers. And yet during the lockdown, these teens were stuck with their family and cut off from peers. The routine of the school day offers so much to a teen socially and different type of activities, and they don't have to necessarily think about it. They go with the flow of the school day, and suddenly they were just thrust into, no, you've got to figure it all out now. You're eating in, you're exercising, all of that.
Yeah, and you can't go outside and exercise. Adding that onto it just complicates things.
Yeah, and how that stripping away from that routine might have opened the door to the eating disorders that she mentioned, and how they're on a rise during this time. It was kind of a prime, fertile ground for that to appear because they were sort of lost.
Yep. I mean, you could see how rates of depression going up and anxiety going up. That's why we see more eating disorders in teenagers. It's been stressful and hard. It was this developmental period in their lives that's already hard. And then you make it harder. So, tips to take away some of the things that Dr. Glassifer mentioned is make sure to take note on your teen's way of eating. Also, talk to them about social media. It's always better to have the conversation than not have it.
Yeah, the general takeaway of just becoming aware and giving some time and attention to what's the baseline for your teen and how they typically behave, so you can notice a difference. And I'm just thinking, sometimes parents, long work day, and it's like, oh, one more thing I have to do. But to catch things early just by paying attention seems really crucial.
Paul, I am excited to hear your conversation with Dr. Rogers. I think he's another really fascinating person. And he's at HCA. And as a little side note for people, HCA Healthcare sponsors this podcast. And I don't know how many people are aware of just how massive they are. They're fully committed to improving lives in so many ways. They have over 275,000 employees. that are working every day to impact patients' lives. They are hospitals and hospital systems. They're in communities throughout the country. They have more than 230 behavioral health programs, which include inpatient, ConnectWorks, treatment centers. They're in a really unique position to make a huge difference in the lives of others. And I just love working with them. And I love that we get to work with them on this podcast. And I'm happy that we also got to talk to one of their leaders because they also have such great people.
Yeah, Marjorie, I look forward to sharing Dr. Rogers' interview with you. He is the medical director of Child and Adolescent Services at the Medical Center of Aurora. His passions are teaching, psychotherapy, and advocating for the needs of families he serves. And what I really enjoyed talking to him was he was on the front lines during the lockdown, during the pandemic. And also, how are things trending now that we're coming out of the pandemic and sort of reestablishing a new normal? As a place to begin, wondering about the impact of masking and social distancing and how did that impact adolescents emotionally, socially? What are we seeing?
With adolescents, I think depending on whether you're on the anxious side of things, which a lot more kids are now, I think post COVID than they might have been, you found them somewhat comforting, not even just for the illness, but I've talked to kids who love the idea that part of their face is covered, that they don't feel like people can read their reaction. And so they can be a bit of a way to hide and also a barrier to really feeling like all of us, it's very hard to know if you're picking up on nonverbal cues the way that you would normally. As our kid explained in her shared experience, that readaptation to some skills that maybe we knew before isn't as easy. It's not just like hopping back on a bike. The removal of mask will be part of that, I think. Kids that are genuinely nervous from an infection standpoint to remove their mask, and then that's becoming something that kids get bullied around, something that kids feel socially ostracized around, or put themselves in a position where they feel like they have to remove a mask because their friends aren't wearing it, but deep down they're deathly afraid that they'll get sick or get a loved one sick. So it's a complicated issue.
Another aspect that I think is helpful to take a look at is with the lockdown and how there's so many rites of passage as a child and as an adolescent. Just wondering about what are you seeing with the social and emotional impacts of missing those milestones in sort of the expected or traditional manner?
That was something that I remember all too well, how it broke my heart that most kids left for spring break and then graduation was canceled and prom was canceled and everything that they had been looking forward to since the first day of first grade were evaporated. And it was really hard for all of us, and especially for those kids. We don't really know if there are long-term effects of missing some of those milestones. As a doctor who talks with kids every day, as a parent myself, my major thought is that we haven't raised such a resilient generation in decades, that these kids have learned to pivot on a dime and have a lot of them are definitely impacted. And I think we want to make sure that help is out there for all of them that need it. But I think a lot of these folks will really rise from the ashes kind of stronger and more able to deal with adversity and loss and disappointment than maybe some of their peers might have even a few years before them. This just provided such an opportunity for things like growth, resilience, post-traumatic growth is something that I'm particularly excited about.
What are we learning about how we're coming out, what's called for the health and well-being of adolescents?
It was a really rough time for teenagers and for those of us who care for them. I'm a inpatient doctor predominantly, which means I treat acutely suicidal teens in an inpatient setting in a locked hospital. And what we've seen for decades prior to COVID was a seasonal pattern of, we get busy during certain months and then during the winter holidays, during spring break, during summertime, we see a dip in our numbers and we get to catch a breath of relief and then get back into the trenches. And from 2020 until this past summer, there was no relief. Every time I discharged one child from my hospital, there were 24 kids in an emergency room waiting for that bed. The visits that we saw in the emergency rooms that were mental health related went up hundreds of percentiles. That was the folks that were actually getting help. The data is clear that there was a profound impact. And We sort of looked at data from the Great Recession back in the earlier 2000s and what the fallout was as far as increased suicides, increased depression and anxiety from this tremendous financial stress that trickled down from parents and adults to their children. And so we anticipated many more problems in our mental health struggles. We're seeing some of that. But I will say that at this time, the hospital is, as many hospitals are, settling down into a little more of a routine as we have come to expect. I'm optimistic that we'll return to the previous state, which honestly wasn't all that great. We have a real epidemic of teen suicide and teen depression, but to hope that we could at least have some normalcy to what we've come to expect would be nice. You asked, what do kids need? I think some of the simplest and most effective mechanisms are they need to be heard. They need to have access to people that care about them, whether they be parents, trusted adults, therapists, peer supports. There's ample data to show that the more we can bring mental health treatment to kids in the school setting, the more effective it is, the more kids we catch.
As teens starting to explore romantic relationships, intimacy, and how was that impacted during the time of COVID and what are we seeing coming out of COVID?
As far as romance and teen love, it's been a bit of a, I want to use the word concerning, but I think that's because I'm old. Online romance and online developing of romantic relationships has become more and more normative. And it's not just adolescents, but that is sort of the one we see the most. And certainly COVID, when people were having more and more online relationships, I think that will progress that trend. I don't think it's my place to say that's a bad thing. I have my reservations as partial to the real world as opposed to a virtual world. As the young lady Elyse, I think, commented in her story, the appreciation for relationships is much more prominent once you have face to face contact taken away. There is a lot of desire to go do kid things and to hang out with friends and maybe put your phone down. This would be a good time to, as parents, to encourage them to put the phone down and be with people romantically or just family friends.
Maybe if our child isn't putting the phone down quite as readily as we would have hoped, what do you recommend we do around that?
I think taking away something that anyone has come to expect is perilous. So I think you have to be cautious about how you do it. I have many parents who come to me and are like, I'm just sick of it. I'm taking social media away. And I'm like, good luck. That's your kid is smarter than you are at finding ways to access this. And if you make it off limits, one, you've made it even more attractive. And two, you've guaranteed that you're not part of your kid's decision making around that. And so I think the most important thing is that parents are interested, aware, and involved. And so I encourage parents to not just ask what kids are doing online, but ask to be taught. What apps are you using? Help me create an account. Is there anything on here I'm going to like? If you let a teen be an expert when you're the parent, then that puts them in a much more mature mindset and they're more likely to come clean and let you know what is good and what is bad. And if you're always harping on, God, I can't stand TikTok. Well, you're only going to hear the good things about TikTok from your kid. And they're not going to share the things that are scary about it or the things that may bug them about it because they're worried you're just going to reinforce the belief that you think it's all bad. And so I think a reasonable amount of time you spend on your phone, the kids should know that you are going to check frequently and randomly. Though usually if you're okay with it and you don't make it guaranteed punishment, but you have an open dialogue about it, then they will often recognize what is unhealthy and take steps towards what is healthy. And some kids are not well equipped for that. Some kids that maybe have a more addictive personality or harder problems with interacting in person may need more strict boundaries around that. But they need to be set up with love. And we're trying to do this voluntarily and it's not working. So what would you do if you were me? I fully empower parents to be parents. You do not need permission from your teen or your child to set the rules in your house. That is a bad idea. But I think because I said so are not very effective. And so I think hearing what your kids have to say, letting them know that it's important to you, even if you disagree around anything, but especially around screens is the right idea. Parents will hesitate to ask if their child is smoking cannabis for fear that they might introduce that idea. Similar, asking, if their child has ever had suicidal thoughts, they're scared they're going to plant an idea. And there's ample research that's the opposite. Asking the question has never been demonstrated to lead to thoughts that weren't there before, but asking those questions proactively and at younger ages than parents might think leads to dialogue that is very protective for kids, leads to parents being a safe place to go to talk when they're making decisions about whether or not they're going to try marijuana or other substances. Asking questions about thoughts of self harm or suicide is not a conversation anyone wants to have with their child, but to not have it leaves you much more likely to receive a very distressing surprise phone call than starting the conversation and making sure that your kid knows one, you're interested, and two, you can handle it. You'd be surprised at how many kids don't tell their parents they're struggling with suicide because they don't want to stress out their parents. Their parents are already enough. Their parents are working too hard already. They feel like a burden. And so by starting that conversation and just saying, I want to know, I'm here for that, amazingly powerful. I think having teens establish care with someone, even if they're not really struggling, is never a bad idea. Even this, do you know your school counselor so that there's some level of trust if symptoms manifest, if they do need more help. So that's a good idea just to sort of proactively get kids into healthy therapy, even if it's periodic check-ins. Everybody's got something they can work on. I also think modeling that as parents is very, very powerful. If my kid is struggling to handle the pressures of feeling like they're judged by teens now that they're back in school, 10,000 years of parent DNA says, you want to tell your kid it's going to be all right, and I want to solve this problem for you. And that is the fastest way for your kid to feel like dad doesn't understand. Mom doesn't get it. I can't talk to them about this. One, again, let them know that you want to hear what they have to say. Don't solve their problems for them. But if you have a story to share, I remember, going back in, and for me, I've been going to work the whole time, but traffic, when it started to come back, I was so grumpy. And, I think just sharing stories about how, as you might have struggles and it might be difficult for you, or you might feel like you messed up at work and people were judging you. Age appropriate, you want to keep them seeing you as a competent parent. But I think modeling that it's not always easy, modeling that if you're going to get your own therapy because you're struggling, that can be very powerful too. I think anytime a child changes well established patterns of behavior, sleep, eating, isolating, not hanging out with people they enjoy, not participating in activities they've enjoyed, even if they tell you everything's okay, that's when I would probably really get help. That those are definitive signs that something is not well. Maybe the kid doesn't even recognize it, but those are very trustworthy signals.
We were both parenting teenagers during this time, and some of these tips I found so helpful about not having knee-jerk reactions to something that's like, oh, stop doing that. We know that's not going to get anywhere. And there's this idea of being interested, aware, and engaged in our teenagers' lives. And you can't go wrong with just being willing to ask what's going on or how you're doing, or even that modeling. I'm struggling. How about you? Being authentic and honest and open with our teens seems to go a real long way.
I love the point about let your teen be an expert.
Yeah.
So that they're more open to talking. And that makes a lot of sense. And asking them to put the phone down, get involved in things. That all makes so much sense. And then letting it go if there are things they don't want to share. Just let it go.
I was thinking some of my sweetest conversations with Noah have been hearing about how I screwed up as a teenager. Did you have this trouble? Did this happen to you? And I find those really tender moments where we connect in a different way. And it's not like me telling him to do something. It's he showing an interest in my life and finding that, oh, dad isn't perfect either. So it's okay if I have trouble too.
You can role model that you don't have it all figured out, then kids pick that up too. And then they don't feel like they have to have it all figured out.
Yeah, I guess coming out of the pandemic, looking at teenagers, again, I'm finding we're ending on a message of hope that there were challenges, there were tough times, and finding that we could grow together and maybe as a parent and a teenager arrive in a place where maybe we're a little stronger. We can make it through tough times. We're a little stronger together because of that.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate you being on this journey with us. We look forward to next week
And our topic for next week is grief and loss, where I get vulnerable and share with you all about my own personal loss experiences. And we'll also hear from Kathy Shear, who is a renowned expert on grief and loss. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It will allow others to find us and join along. Coming Back Better is executive produced by Jacob Morrison. It is produced and edited by Juliana Castro. The series was developed in collaboration with Linda Rosenberg, Carla Cantor, and Kristen Watson from Columbia University Department of Psychiatry, and Manisha Shah, Dr. Frank Drummond, and Amy Rushton from HCA Healthcare. Research is assisted by Melissa Leaf. Show artwork was created by Arnella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. Audience strategy is by Alyssa Fackler, Sarah Hale, and Alyssa Yarama. A very special thanks to Andrea Rollback, Trevin Stegall, Evelyn Valentine, Kaylee Sneed, Julie Plummer, Thad Thomas, Paul Kay, and Elizabeth Roosevelt. Coming Back Better is a co-production from Psych Hub and Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and is brought to you by HCA Healthcare. I'm Paul Deger, and my co-host Marjorie Morrison and I thank you for joining us. See you next week.